Some stories are shocking not only because of the brutality of the events, but because of the complete absence of humanity. The case we're about to share today, with the utmost sensitivity and respect, has become a symbol of injustice and outrage in Japan and around the world. It's the real story of a young Japanese student whose life was cut short in an unimaginable way. This is not just another crime case. It's a grim reminder of the failures of a system that, at times, doesn't protect those who need it most. And throughout this video, we're going to dive deep into the details of the investigation, the timeline of events, the trial, and the impact this case had on an entire society. If you're sensitive to difficult topics, we recommend proceeding with caution. Our goal here is to inform, reflect, and honor the memory of a life unjustly taken, never to glorify evil. Buckle up, because this is one of the hardest stories we've ever told. But it's a story that must be told. It was the end of an ordinary afternoon in Tokyo, on November 25th, 1988. Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old student known for her dedication to school and her exemplary behavior, was on her way home after a day of classes. Intelligent, kind, and always carrying a quiet smile, Junko dreamed of a simple and peaceful life. But on that day, she would cross paths with someone who would tragically alter her story forever. As she walked along a route that was usually safe, Junko was approached by Hiroshi Miyano, an 18-year-old already known to the local police. He wasn't alone. Accompanied by a group with a history of petty crimes, Hiroshi carried himself with confidence and control. Using a manipulative tactic, he staged a fake situation, a kind of setup, to make her believe she needed his help. It was a carefully planned trap. Junko, like any teenager who trusts her surroundings, didn't suspect a thing. The calm tone and seemingly friendly appearance of the boys masked the dark intentions behind that encounter. Confused and unsure, she was led to an unfamiliar place. But this wasn't just a change of direction. It was the beginning of a nightmare that should have never happened. Everything unfolded quickly, coldly, and with disturbing calculation. The plan had been in place for days, and Junko, completely unaware of what was coming, found herself caught in a web of violence disguised as companionship. From that moment on, her once peaceful life began to unravel in the shadows. What followed was a sequence of events that exposed deep failures in society, justice, and human empathy. Events that are still remembered to this day, not only for what happened, but for the chilling silence that surrounded them. And the question that still echoes is, where were those who could have stopped it? After being forcibly taken, Junko Furuta was held in a place where no one would have suspected at first glance, the home of one of the perpetrators. The property, located in a residential neighborhood in the city of Misato, belonged to the family of Nobuharu Minato, one of the boys involved in the case. The domestic setting, seemingly ordinary, concealed a disturbing reality, hidden in plain sight by the very people who lived there. What's most terrifying is that Minato's parents lived in the house and were aware of Junko's presence. However, intimidated by their own sons and threatened by ties to local criminal groups, they chose silence. That silence, which could have saved a life, became a silent accomplice to the tragedy. The inaction of the adults and the lack of intervention from authorities would later become part of the public outrage surrounding the case. During that time, Junko was kept in inhumane conditions, with no contact with the outside world and no way to call for help. Even though she was in a busy neighborhood, she was completely isolated, as if she had vanished from existence. Life outside the house continued as usual, while inside the young girl was enduring an extreme and heartbreaking ordeal. The perpetrators were part of a group that boasted about their impunity. They had connections to dangerous organizations and believed they could act without consequences. That feeling of invincibility pushed them to commit increasingly cruel acts, fueling the belief that no one would stop them. The atmosphere of fear they created was so intense that even neighbors and family members were too afraid to speak out. In this climate of silence and unchecked cruelty, days turned into weeks, and what could have been stopped with a single phone call or a brave act was allowed to go on far too long. Junko's suffering, ignored by so many, became a tragic symbol of how fear can silence even those closest to the truth. While Junko Furuta was missing, her family acted in desperation. They contacted the school, filed a missing person report at the local police station, and began handing out flyers around the city. But, as happens in many cases, the initial investigation didn't receive the attention it deserved. Junko was classified as a runaway teenager, and authorities assumed she had left of her own free will. That assumption would come at a high cost. While the police chased fragile theories, Hiroshi Miyano and his accomplices continued to maintain a normal facade. They even went out in public, hung out in arcades, and acted as if nothing was wrong. This confidence wasn't just cold-hearted. It was fueled by the certainty that no one suspected them, and for weeks, they were right. The authorities had no idea how close they were to the truth. At one point, the police actually received a tip about a girl being held against her will inside the Minato household. A concerned classmate of the suspects made an anonymous report, but when officers knocked on the door, the young men denied everything, and, unbelievably, the police accepted their story. No search was conducted. No further questions were asked. A chance to save Junko was lost. That poorly handled visit by the police became one of the most infuriating parts of the case. A real opportunity to stop what was still unfolding was simply ignored. The lack of follow-through and blind trust in empty words sealed Junko's fate. From that moment on, the perpetrators felt even more untouchable. Junko's tragedy wasn't only the result of a group's cruelty, it was also the direct consequence of a chain of negligence. Authorities, neighbors, family members, even society itself, failed her at some point. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Not only what was done to Junko, but how much was allowed to happen right in front of everyone's eyes. Over time, the names of the main individuals involved in the Junko Furuta case became known across Japan, not for any admirable reason, but for being at the center of one of the most disturbing criminal episodes in the country's history. They were 4 young men, all under the age of 20, connected by a toxic bond and a pattern of problematic behavior that had never been properly addressed. Hiroshi Miyano was the leader of the group. At 18, he already had ties to juvenile criminal organizations. Arrogant and controlling, he believed he was above the law. His actions showed clear signs of cold calculation and premeditation. He was the one who devised the plan to abduct Junko, convincing the others to take part in the crime. Throughout the ordeal, his behavior was described as cruel and completely lacking remorse. Nobuharu Minato, also 18, offered his own home as the hiding place. The fact that his parents were present and still failed to act became one of the most shocking elements of the case. Nobuharu, though under Hiroshi's influence, actively participated in the group's decisions and helped maintain the atmosphere of fear inside the house. Shinji Minato, Nobuharu's younger brother, was 16 and known for being impulsive and unpredictable. Although his role was initially downplayed, later investigations confirmed his direct involvement. Yasushi Watanabe, 17, was the most reserved of the 4, but no less responsible. His constant presence and silent complicity made him equally guilty. The young age of those involved sparked intense debate across the country. How could teenagers with their entire lives ahead of them commit such cold-blooded acts? How had both the school system and their families failed them so deeply? These questions echoed through the media and the courts, leading to nationwide discussions about juvenile criminal responsibility and reforms in how Japan approached youth crime. In time, their names became symbols, not just of the crime itself, but of a system that desperately needed change. They didn't just commit a crime, they reflected a society that, for some reason, had ignored all the warning signs that something was terribly wrong. When the truth finally came to light, the reaction was immediate. The revelation of what had happened to Junko Furuta triggered a wave of outrage across Japan. News outlets ran headlines filled with condemnation and calls for justice. And when the perpetrators were arrested, the public expected severe and exemplary punishment. But what unfolded in court only deepened the nation's anger. The 4 young men were charged, but because they were under the age of 20, the legal threshold to be tried as adults in Japan at the time, their real names were initially protected by law. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, authorities chose to conduct the trial under juvenile court regulations. That decision drew heavy criticism from legal experts, journalists, and ordinary citizens. Many saw it as an insult to the memory of the victim. The sentences handed down also sparked public outrage. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, received 20 years in prison. Nobuharu Minato was sentenced to 5 years, while Shinji and Yasushi served similar terms, ranging from 5 to 8 years. For most people, the punishments didn't match the gravity of what had been done. Many asked, how could someone who destroyed a life so cruelly have the right to rebuild their own just a few years later? During the trial, defense attorneys argued that the defendants came from dysfunctional families, showed signs of emotional immaturity, and were influenced by a toxic social environment. While these arguments carried some legal weight, they did little to ease the pain of Junko's family, especially her parents, who sat through the proceedings without ever receiving the answers or relief they had hoped for. Initially, the Japanese media respected the legal protection of the suspects' identities. But as information began to leak and public pressure mounted, their names were gradually revealed. The rise of the internet at the time helped preserve the details of the case, turning Junko Furuta into a lasting symbol of the fight for justice and reform in the juvenile justice system. Civil movements began to emerge, demanding changes to the law, especially in cases of violent crimes committed by minors. Rather than bringing closure, the trial reopened even deeper wounds, and Junko Furuta's name came to represent more than just a victim of a heinous crime. She became a symbol of a society that, for too long, remained silent in the face of the unacceptable. Despite the tragedy, Junko Furuta's name was never forgotten. On the contrary, her story became a symbol of resilience and a turning point for urgent debates within Japanese society. The impact of the case was so profound that it is still discussed today in schools, universities, human rights forums, and special reports, always as a reminder of the importance of taking a stand against evil and protecting the most vulnerable. After the trial concluded, several civil organizations began pressuring the Japanese government for changes to the juvenile justice system. Public outcry demanded that crimes of extreme brutality be judged more severely, even when committed by minors. As a result, new reforms were proposed, and some were implemented, increasing penalties in exceptional cases and allowing for the public identification of those involved in shocking crimes. Moreover, the case revealed the urgent need to examine the roles of schools, communities, and families in preventing youth violence. Psychological support programs in schools gained more attention, as did policies aimed at combating bullying and preventing teenagers from being lured by criminal groups. The crime against Junko became a wake-up call for all sectors of society, highlighting the consequences of ignoring warning signs. Junko's memory was also honored in meaningful ways. Students and teachers from her former school organized silent tributes in her name. Poems, letters, and heartfelt messages were placed near her home in symbolic gestures of affection and remembrance. Even films and books, many fictionalized, were inspired by the case, reflecting on pain, injustice, and the search for healing, even when her name wasn't mentioned directly. Most importantly, decades after her passing, Junko Furuta lives on in the collective memory. Her story remains a call to conscience, compassion, and the courage to speak out. Though nothing can undo what happened, the impact of her interrupted life continues to shine as a beacon against indifference and as a permanent demand for real justice. The case of Junko Furuta crossed the borders of Japan. Over time, newspapers from other countries began reporting on what had happened, always with shock and caution. The silence that lasted 44 days inside a house in Misato began to echo around the world, not through protests or loud cries, but through a story that spoke for itself. A quiet, isolated young girl whose voicelessness became one of the loudest cries against injustice. That silence, which should have been broken by neighbors, authorities, and even the families of those involved, became the subject of reflection across the globe. How can a society fail so deeply in the face of someone's suffering? How did no one step in effectively? Despite the many visible signs, these questions stopped being about Japan alone. They became universal, relevant to any community, in any country. In the years that followed, the case began to be studied by psychologists, sociologists, and criminologists. Discussions about the normalization of violence, the power of inaction, and the devastating effects of impunity became more frequent. Junko Furuta, without ever asking for it, became a symbol of the urgent need to reform social structures that allow evil to grow in places where protection should exist. The internet played a crucial role in preserving her memory. Websites, forums, and documentary videos began to tell her story, reaching generations who weren't even born when it all happened. In many of these spaces, Junko's story is shared alongside messages of empathy, mourning, and outrage, a late but heartfelt support network that seeks to honor the dignity of someone whose very humanity was denied. In the end, Junko's silence was broken, not by her, but by those who refused to forget. And in that collective act of remembrance, her story was lifted up as a living memorial, an eternal reminder that silence, too, can be as destructive as the violence itself. As the years passed, the 4 young men involved in the Junko Furuta case served their sentences and were gradually released. However, their return to society did not go unnoticed. The public, still deeply scarred by the crime, reacted with outrage each time news broke that one of them had left the prison system. The sense of injustice remained strong, fueled by the stark contrast between the short length of their sentences and the horrifying nature of their actions. Hiroshi Miyano, the main perpetrator, was released after serving just over 15 years. Upon release, he changed his name and tried to rebuild his life away from public scrutiny, but his past followed him. Several attempts to reintegrate were disrupted by new accusations, rumors, and further legal trouble. On one occasion, he was even arrested for assault. His effort to erase his history failed. The name Miyano had already become synonymous with cruelty in many circles. Nobuharu Minato also changed his identity and moved away from his hometown. However, in 2018, he returned to the headlines after being arrested again for assaulting a man with a disability. The incident reignited public debate over the effectiveness of rehabilitation in such extreme cases. People questioned whether someone capable of ignoring such immense suffering could ever truly change. For many, there was no room for second chances when it came to crimes like this. Shinji Minato and Yasushi Watanabe chose to live even more quietly. There were unconfirmed reports that one of them had moved abroad. The other, according to independent investigations, was believed to be living under family protection, far from the internet and public life. Still, their past continues to follow them like a shadow, and on many online forums and social media platforms, their true identities are still being exposed and discussed. The reintegration of all 4 into society was never complete. Public outrage remains, even decades later. Many believe that true justice was never served, and that the peaceful lives some of them attempt to live today stand in stark contrast to the life they so brutally stole from Junko. This tension between legal closure and public memory lingers, as if the case, though officially closed in the courts, remains very much unresolved in the hearts of the people. Decades have passed since that tragic autumn of 1988, yet the story of Junko Furuta continues to be told, not for shock value, nor out of morbid curiosity, but because her journey represents something far greater, the silent cry of all victims who were once forgotten. Speaking about Junko is an act of resistance against forgetting. It's a reminder of what happens when evil finds space in the silence of others. The case left deep scars on the collective consciousness. Many who hear the story for the first time feel a mix of disbelief and outrage. How could this have happened? Why didn't anyone do anything? These questions, even without complete answers, still echo. And in that echo lies the reason why Junko's name has never truly disappeared. It became a symbol. Painful, yes, but necessary. In popular culture, the case has inspired fictional works exploring themes like isolation, abuse of power, and the failure of systems meant to protect the vulnerable. On online forums, people from around the world post messages of empathy, remembering her story with the dignity it deserves. This shows that although Junko suffered alone, her memory is no longer alone. It is now carried by millions who refuse to let her pain be forgotten. Moreover, Junko Furuta has become a reference point in academic discussions on criminology, social psychology, and juvenile justice. Scholars analyze the case not only through legal lenses, but also as a reflection of a culture that sometimes values reputation more than the protection of life. By exposing these failures, Junko's story continues to inspire change, even if slow, in the societies that examine it. Ultimately, speaking about Junko Furuta is an act of remembrance. It's a way of ensuring that her voice, so cruelly silenced, continues to be heard through those who care, not just as a victim, but as someone whose story still has the power to change the world around us. Junko Furuta was not a fictional character. She was a real young woman, with dreams, plans, and a future ahead of her. A dedicated student, a beloved daughter, an ordinary teenager whose life was cut short by a senseless act of brutality. Her story is an open wound in the collective memory, not only of Japan, but of everyone who learns what happened and refuses to accept it as just another case. Throughout this video, we've walked through a narrative that is difficult, painful, and at times infuriating. We've done so with the utmost sensitivity and responsibility, because we believe that some stories must not be forgotten. They need to be told, not to instill fear, but to awaken awareness, to remind us that every silence has a cost, and that every act of inaction can cost a life. The case of Junko Furuta is more than a crime. It's a mirror of who we are as a society, how far we're willing to go to protect one another, how much we tolerate the unacceptable, and how easily we let evil hide behind closed doors. Let the pain of this story serve as a warning. Let her name, instead of fading with time, continue to echo as a call for justice, empathy, and courage. If you've made it this far, carry this story with you. Share it with those who need to understand that indifference is one of the most dangerous forms of violence. And always remember, honoring the memory of a victim also means fighting to ensure others never suffer the same fate.